Very cool. Alrighty. We'll jump into the actual talk itself. Anyone who misses out the start, they're probably not missing much. It's just me rambling through what this session will look like. So we are here for Women and Girls Week, but our agenda kind of spreads across multiple things. So today we'll be unpacking some gender myths, coaching considerations that these actually impact on, and then of course the broader impact of female coaches. Now, I did want to flag for anyone who hasn't seen me present before, I'm not your typical presenter, and therefore this will not follow the typical way that a webinar would. We've actually got a combination of slides, but then also a conversation with some three amazing guests. So throughout this talk, we will be sharing a bit of information, the things that we've learned along the way through research and practice, but then we'll also be tapping into the rich stories of our guests along the way. So expect kind of 2 to 3 slides of information and then a roughly 10-minute sort of mini podcast episode with our guests where we unpack why those things are important and their experiences of that particular topic. And so as we move through, it's important to remember what we're talking about in the first place. And so when we define gender, I really like Markula's and colleagues' definition here, which is the psychological, sociological, and cultural differences among men and women while distinguishing gender from biological sex. So these are not the same things, but unfortunately, in our research, we use these terms interchangeably. So at times, women and girls might be used as female athletes as well, because that is the space that we've been researching in, but please note that they are not the same thing. So let's start with the positive things. And I say positive with an asterisk. So if you do see an asterisk along the lines, it's probably because I've added it in to make a comment about that particular word. If you've been in women and girls sport for at any time at all, you've probably heard I love coaching women, but they always need to know why. And there is a deeper level to this particular statement. So women do have a greater tendency and preference to explore the rationale behind coaching decisions and a higher affinity with being involved in the decision-making process. So as far as stereotypes and myths go, this is probably the most positive one that we see. It's not particularly a bad thing to need to know why. The reason why we want to ask those questions is a little deeper, and we will unpack that in a later section of this talk. But when most people think about women and girls and sport, this is a common statement that we hear from coaches of female athletes. And when you start here, you think, it's not that bad, right? Like needing to know why is probably a really good thing. Well, when I started to dig into what other people say about women and girls and female athletes, these were some of the other common myths. So I'm really lucky in that someone has dedicated their research specifically to this space. And so in particular, Jyoti Gosai and colleagues here has spent a lot of time unpacking the other common myths that we hear. So when they interviewed and observed a number of high-level coaches in a high-performance space of female athletes, these were some of the comments that were either explicitly said or discussed in the stories that they were telling about their coaching experiences with female athletes. Needless to say, when I made this slide, I kind of spiraled for the rest of the week. And I've been having it on my desk for a while now because some of these statements I feel quite personally, but I've also heard in conversation. So not only are there slightly positive ones, like women being more coachable, we often hear that they're less competent, less able, less competitive, physically inferior, emotionally needy, that's my favorite one, mentally inferior, less worthy, and more fragile. And the issue here is that not all of these things were explicitly said. It's not like going out there and saying, wow, this women's team is physically inferior. Therefore, we need to address this explicitly. It's actually in the way that they talk about the athletes, thinking that they are treating people in a similar vein, that we hear a lot of these statements. So the myths alone are not problematic, but the way that they shape our behaviors as coaches may be. And they create a never ending cycle of continuous gendering of coaching, either conscious or unconscious, whereby male athletes are viewed as more competent, able, and physically superior in comparison to female athletes. Now, this explicitly is the problem. It's not the fact that these myths exist, but the way that they have systematically placed people at a different stage of hierarchy. And that influences the way we therefore engage with them, the opportunities we present them, etc. And so nobody I know can speak to this better than Sophia Nimphius. Now, we are seeing a shift. And again, you'll note the little asterisks I've left myself here. So female athletes are becoming more competitive, more physically demanding, and more performance oriented. But I would argue that becoming isn't the problem. It is now more socially acceptable to be outwardly competitive, outwardly demanding, and be more performance oriented because we have the systems in place and the societal expectations that this is what athletes do. So it is an immense pleasure to actually have Sophia Nimphius on the call tonight as our first guest speaker, because you have seen this happening consistently across sport and physical activity sectors and spent most of your career calling it out. So the first question I wanted to pose to you, is what do we need to do differently so we don't host the exact same webinar in a few years' time and just keep having the same conversations?
All right, well, I'll just get the sad part out of the way. We may have to host the same webinar in a few years, probably 10 years, maybe 20, actually probably for a couple decades, and I'll tell you the reason why. While change does occur, change occurs slowly, and it's often generationally. So it's really hard to unlearn things fundamentally. I inadvertently just make everyone really sad by a small little prediction that I have that the first generation of girls in societies that are currently on the upper third of gender equality. So this probably doesn't bode well for countries that still have a ways to go. And so we have to acknowledge that we're talking in the Australian context, and we may be progressing, but there's lots of countries that are way earlier on the journey. So I'm just talking about the Australian context, but our first generation, probably even here in Australia, that'll have the chance to not have to have this seminar is probably at least when the current generation are great grandparents. All right, so like our girls that are probably just being born to under the age of 11, when they're great grandparents, they may be the first generation where we might not have to have this, and I'll explain why. Generational influence is powerful. The stories that our grandparents tell us, and the stories that our parents tell us. But unfortunately, with those generations being absorbed with some of the myths that you've shared, they share it even in the best meaning ways, and that influences us. And you can't unhear things. I don't know if anyone's ever had this scenario where you say, "I'll never unhear that," or "I'll never unsee that." That's true. So while you're listening to this, your brain's changing whether you want it to or not. That's a positive, I think. But at the same time, it changes again with all of those different competing influences. So the downside of that is social shifts occur generationally. And so with women and girls getting greater opportunities to play, you'll need that generation to know no different, and that generation needs to be a great grandparent. So as they're passing on the stories, the stories are within the context that we're hoping to talk about today.
I almost felt like the wind went out of my lungs when you were like, when they're great grandparents, as someone who never, met their grandparents like once. The thought of that is immense. But I think one thing that you said there in particular is that they know no different. So until we get to a point where people know no different, where this is an expectation, a reality for everybody, have you seen any strides that are really indicating that we can get there? Like, what is the benchmark, I guess, for you to think that, okay, this is where the generation is? How do we know it's coming, I guess, that quickly? I'm going to try and be optimistic and say quickly.
Yeah. So I think we're in the generation of the girl dad. So the girl dad right now gives me hope that we've got the opportunity to get there, right? So every once in a while, the girl dad narrative does drive me a little bit wild, because I think, oh, well, all of us came from a person that at birth was a woman. So we all came of women. So that probably should have been an instigator for you to be pro women and girls. But if it takes the woman in your life to be your daughter, I'll take it. But nonetheless, with that said, I just did a talk yesterday or the day before at ASCA on Friday night. And I've never had so many men come up to me after the talk to explicitly be impassioned by wanting to hear a message that can be hard to hear, and then be willing to want to actively be part of the change for it. And so I'm not saying that never happened before, but I'm telling you it's happening in numbers that at least I, in my N=1 observation, can say this is a generational shift that's happening. And it gives me hope that those people will be, grandfathers, and they will be continuing their girl dad, but in a different generation, and them influencing and giving permission to the other women in their lives to be as big advocates, because remember that we're all socialized. And so men and women actually portray and reiterate the same social biases. It's not actually just exclusively men that perpetuate this. If anything, many of them said, I'm really trying to push the thing, but the people that I have the hardest time working with is the perceptions of their moms. So it's this weird dichotomy, but it's actually that's actually a really powerful thing to show you that it's not inherent of men to not want to help, and it's not inherent of women to know better. Just you have more opportunities to question what's being done through self-reflection. So I do have hope. So I hate to start with a multi-generational change thing, but I am seeing that change right now.
And it's so funny that you say the mums in particular, because I've been really targeting them anytime I see them standing on the boundary of a sporting event. And in particular, if we do coaching visits and go to training, I'll often go straight to the mums and be like, so why aren't you coaching right now? And they're like, oh, no, not me. I do realize it's quite confrontational, but I think it's important to be like, okay, well, why you could just as easily be out there running this training session, doing these activities, keeping people engaged, doing all the good things that coaches do inherently from the skill set that you have. And they're like, no, I'm not a coach, which is a really terrifying statement. Even people who fill in for a coach, just because they don't have the name next to them on their registration form, will immediately say, I'm not a coach, even though they have all of the skills that they could possibly need to be a good coach. In terms of like our space now and skill development, what are some of the things that you're seeing now that are maybe giving you that hope, not just in the research space, but also in the practitioner space?
Yeah, so there's a really interesting paper just came out last year. It's Gurevich and Lavoie, I believe, and they talk about like these stages that we progress, and the stage one is like essentialism. There must be like an absolute difference between the specifically amongst the sexes that are reiterated by these gendered expressions. And then we kind of go, then some people are like, no, I see this totally neutrally. I don't see gender or sex. I'm just like, it's like people that say they don't see race. It's like, it's a funny way to approach, but it is like a step away from having this assumption of essentialist differences. And where I think we are now is the third of 5 phases that they say as you're like progressing to like just break the glass ceiling, I suppose, but is to be sensitive of these socialized norms that come through. Now you don't necessarily have any solutions for it at that point, but you're aware of it. And some of the solutions actually inadvertently reiterate those norms, as you mentioned to the start, but without getting to the stage of being aware there's things outside of this inherent assumption that you just pop out the womb and whatever you are identified as birth gives just like all these characteristics underneath you, that it couldn't possibly be the world around us. It's people realizing that sensitivity around it and figuring out a way to navigate it. And when you start figuring out ways to see it as positive, they say it's responsive. And then when you fully flip it, and some people have a different definition of feminism, which makes them step off to the side and say, I'm not possibly a feminist. But if you're on this call, then you probably believe in the social, economic, and broad equality of the sexes. So then, yes, you are a feminist, by the way, even if you don't like the word. Maybe it's got some bad branding or something. But when you go to a kind of a feminist approach and you use that to empower everybody, You like flip it and say all these approaches that are very relational and, kind of just flipping the dynamics of a top-down approach on its head. Those are feminist ideals. When that becomes like the reverse norm for all, that's kind of like that transformative side. We are totally not there because we can't even get the definition of feminist right, but that's okay. So with that said, if I work back, that sensitive environment, some people a little further, like I said, being very responsive to it and trying to shake the shackles of gender norms. I think that's where we are. And there's lots of characteristics, even people trying to wrestle. Do we need all women environments, or is it best to have mixed environments? And right now we're in sometimes yes to both. So it depends. It depends. And the reason we need that is because we're all in the sensitive phase. Yeah.
So how do we know, my final question to you, how do we know that we've kind of evolved through that phase and moved to the next one? Is there anything that we can notice in our own environments, things that we can strive towards after the call to make sure that we keep moving towards, I guess, this next phase of development?
Yeah, that's actually a really hard question for me to answer because I think so much of what I'm conveying is actually my own personal experience. So, but with that, I think when you start flipping what you're saying, so you say the reverse, and if it's something you wouldn't say in the reverse in a context of like a men or boys predominant environment, then when you stop needing to do that because you just start flipping the narrative all the time, you're really moving through beyond probably responsive and being transformative. So in my head, it is natural for me to be like, if I said it the other way, would that be offensive? And when you don't even have to do that question, you natural that's how you speak, that's how you think. You've transitioned. I liken it to this for anybody that speaks a second language. So when you start speaking a second language, at first you're exhausted every day because you constantly translate. And when you get to the point where you dream in your second language, you're like well over there. You don't have to translate back and forth. So when you start translating in your head and flipping things, you're very much on the journey. And when you stop even having to do that, it's normal, then you're like in your second language native.
That's such a cool way to think about it. So I think my two takeaways from that section in particular, if you're on the call, you're probably a feminist. And if you're not sure, flip it. Which is like, as much as this feels like an airy concept that is really difficult to grasp, I think those are two really tangible things to hold on to. And I guess the risk of these conversations, these webinars, these, decontextualized environments is that we don't walk away feeling like we can do something about it. But that absolutely gives me something to think about, the next time that I walk into any environment. So thank you so much for that. We didn't actually know where that conversation would go. So I'm really stoked with where we ended up. And I hadn't actually thought about that paper. So I will definitely be reading it the next time I jump offline. We're going to move on to the next section, which is perfectly set up in terms of coaching considerations. So if we move back to this boring slide deck compared to that rich conversation, we do have a number of coaching considerations that we can take. So again, the importance of this information is not to think of it as like this standalone context or words on a page, but actually things that can inspire action. So some of the things that we've seen along the way in terms of coaching considerations are actually just the experiences that we have. And again, building our sensitivity to it. What is really happening in these environments? And what do we need to know about them to do something about it? So what Gosai and colleagues found in one of their studies is that male coaches use more of the behaviors that female athletes dislike or least prefer when coaching. So in particular, these were performance-related organization and leadership behaviors. So an excessive amount of questioning, trying to be funny, talking about the organization's performance as a whole rather than what the team is doing and how they can get better. These things would really grind on the female athlete experience themselves, despite explicitly saying that this isn't necessarily the environment that they thrive in. We also found that coaches provide more support, encouragement, and instruction towards female athletes. But while this sounds positive in nature to begin with, it might actually become from their bias that they're less skilled. So, an inability to do so by themselves, of to develop their own skills in a self-determined way, means that they need to provide that more support, more encouragement, and extra instruction because they haven't had the opportunities to do so. But then, funnily enough, male athletes actually spent more time at training, practicing their skills, performing activities, or being kept purposefully active. So there's this really interesting tension between the need to provide instruction and support, but also designing in less time for active skill development, which then feeds the narrative that they're less skillful, which then adds more instruction and encouragement. And it almost becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in our coaching considerations, the one thing we really wanted to target as a risk is that it isn't the female athletes that are perceived different or atypical to male athletes that is the problem, because undeniably they are. And not because they're females, but because they're unique people. The risk here is the additional perception that they are inferior, which is problematic. So, if we start to think of it in terms of superiority and inferiority, we can then flip the script, as Soph said, around what good coaching is. And ultimately, good coaching is good coaching. So, when we talk about the things that we want to spend our time doing at training as coaches, in particular, we think about the coach athlete relationship. So, time and time again, a relationship between the coach and the athlete where they do feel comfortable, where they feel safe and open and supported and welcomed, but also challenged, is a great place for people to thrive, not just in a sporting context, but in general. And so, with the coach athlete relationship at the heart of coaching, we start to think of people as individuals with unique experiences, with unique abilities and capabilities that they can develop, and unique social environments that they exist in. It allows us to put the spotlight on someone's experience, but also take a step back and zoom out on all of the things that they experience at the same time to consider where we are in this big, complex space of the human experience. And I say that quite openly because coaching isn't necessarily just about the sporting context that you're in, but the human development of this wonderful person in front of you. And so we do have a responsibility to actually consider what that individual athlete needs and how we can support those needs. So, to come back to that women need to know why statement, I think it almost comes full circle in that people often ask why so they can regain autonomy over the situation. I'm not going to do something because you told me to. I want to know why we need to do it so then I can actively say, yes, that is something I want to do. Therefore, I'm going to buy in and do this thing. If we do it for the sake of buy-in, most people can tell. But if we do it for the sake of relatedness, which is a basic psychological need, then we do see a different level of engagement. Now, the point that the paper makes in particular is that being a basic psychological need, everybody needs this. So building relatedness with female athletes is great, but actually we probably haven't spent enough time doing this with male athletes because we've almost overemphasized it in one environment and underemphasized it in another. There were some amazing quotes in the paper around, the boys will, run through a brick wall if I told them to. Yeah, that's equally problematic. Like, just because someone's going to ask you why, and I actually wrote a comment, just because, like, I know that's an example and it's probably a rash example, but that statement alone is concerning. So, when we do actually design training, we want to design in feedback, challenges, and success so that we don't just overload people with positive experiences. Yes, we want them to feel supported, but too much reinforcement means that they become dependent on your perception of what's happening, your feedback, your positive reinforcement, instead of their own self-esteem that they are getting better at the thing that they're working towards. So ultimately, gender then becomes one of many considerations, and it may or may not have an effect on determining the coaching method or approach that you take in this moment. And so this is a really perfect time to now interview Kate Starre. So Kate, you're no stranger to the full gamut of coaching styles and crafted your own over the years. So the question I wanted to start with you is it difficult to kind of shift towards that person-centered coaching? And do you maybe remember the moment where you decided that that was worthwhile for you?
Yeah, a couple a couple of things before we get to, I do sort of remember where I thought, there's a better way. But so I played in the national team, hockey team for 10 years, and I have never had a female coach. In fact, my whole life, I have never been coached by a woman. Saying that, I was lucky when I did play that I had Rick Charlesworth, and he had a very relational approach to coaching. I think that was because we had a great psych who instructed him on, it was more human dignity. I'm not saying it was a gendered approach. It was human dignity, and he was being led. And I'm not saying it wasn't a gendered environment, because we had times in my career where when Hockeyroos moved to bodysuits, there was a newspaper article that said sex sells in sport. So, put them in lycra. So we had this coach who was very aware about human dignity, who really, really worked hard to build individual relationships with every single player. And I think that was part of our success. Did that translate for me immediately into saying or thinking relational coaching is better? Not really. I think that whilst I was in that environment, I didn't think too much about a gendered approach. And a lot of that was the time and the era also that I played in. It was 2000s. So there was a lot of money for women's sport. We didn't have the pressure of demanding broadcast payments and all those things to get women's sport, particularly Olympic sport, recognised, because we were successful. Anyway, it was post that I think a lot of the bigger pressures on commercial products have happened. But when I left playing and I started coaching, and one of my first coaching experiences was in America. And going back to our psychologist, actually, one of the things that she had was, you don't have to like everyone, but you have to respect them. Everyone will have an ability that you don't have, or they can do something better than you. And in turn, you can do something better than anyone else. But you have to respect everyone and their ability. I went to the US and coached, and I had been in this elite environment for a long time. And then I was starting to meet these athletes that were so multi-talented. I was coaching hockey athletes that could sing, that could play musical instruments, that could speak, like, without exaggeration, 3, 4, 5 languages. And I think that's where it hit me, that relational coaches and building a relationship with your players, male, female, whatever, is important, because they have something to teach you, and you can see the whole, as you were saying, you can see the whole person. And I think that's when it became important to me that I'm not coaching a woman, I'm not coaching a man, I'm coaching a person that needs development. And I think that lends itself to competition as well. And it's sort of one of the things that I think you had up, that women are less competitive. Women want to be competitive. Do they want to be screamed at if they don't win? No, but I don't think men do either. So I think there's that balance of developing competitive environments that give a person the chance and the ability to improve, even measure themselves, without having this constant battle of, if you don't reach that, there's going to be a punishment.
Yeah. I remember the conversation around, like, the AFLW, the Matildas in particular, around the way that they were criticizing the athletes when they compete, right? So there was this ongoing, probably in the last decade or so, where everybody who was performing at a high level would only ever really get praise. And people were saying that that's such a shallow way to kind of support women's sport, right? Is it's like, well, if you really wanted to be equitable, then you would open them up to the criticisms and things of performance that everyone else is under as well. And then people start to realize, oh, we're probably treating male athletes really terribly as well with all of these criticisms. And yet we're just going to copy paste that across for the sake of professionalism. Now, I know you spend a lot of time in the gendered environment space now, and considering those things, there's got to be a better way than just sort of copy pasting everything across and then realizing, oh, maybe this didn't work in the first place.
Yeah, there definitely is. I think Soph's probably got a lot to say on this too, if we look back at Title IX and how, Soph, jump in, that it's an educational policy in the US where you need to have equal resources for male and females, which is great. That's fantastic. But if we look at a coaching perspective, there was not enough preparation to allow coaches, administrators, managers to develop. So instead of building or grabbing like the female perspective and running with that, we're like, oh, we've got all these female athletes now. And AFLW did exactly the same. We've got all these female athletes. And it's like, what do we do? And what was done in America, what was done here with AFLW is we're like, we think that men have all the knowledge. We'll get male coaches in. And it's provided a mini environment. And I think AFLW are trying to do it a little bit differently. We have to acknowledge that men aren't the ones with all the knowledge. We can acknowledge that women don't want necessarily to be in that environment. One of the things that drives me insane when I see the media trying to promote the rivalries in men's sport and bring it over to the women. So, Collingwood hate Carlton. Like, do they? Do the women who play for Collingwood hate the women who play for Carlton? I don't know if that's a rivalry. But don't try to make up these traditions that the women will just follow. And I think in that respect, women should be comfortable in creating their own traditions and creating their own environments, which may be similar, but they may be very different.
Is there anything about that sort of person-centered approach? I mean, we're talking about taking the perspective of the people who are involved and running with it. That can be a really difficult thing to start in, right? And especially if people haven't experienced that before. I remember the first time I started using questioning in my coaching and everyone's like, oh my God, why are you asking me all of these questions? Person-centered coaching can be kind of similar too. Is there anything that you've learned along the way to kind of almost gradually, comfortably, but also almost quite innovatively tap back into the individual?
I love this question. Because I've been in environments. My first answer on top of that is, no matter the age or the level of your athlete, be genuinely inquisitive about what they think about their sport, because they're playing it. You're not, as a coach. And I think that sort of as my coaching career progressed, that was sort of my overriding theory. Be inquisitive about what your players think. And I often said, and Mickey, you can jump in on this, like, I tried to put myself out of a job a lot of times, because if you can get your players or your staff to a level where they know what they're doing and you're redundant, I think you've done an excellent job. In that, the questioning and asking questions, I've shared this story about coaching with an all-male staff who thought they were using a Socratic method of learning, and they would ask a question and keep asking the same question until the athletes gave the answer that they wanted. I'm like, that is not inquisitive. That's not open-minded. If you're going to ask a question of your athletes or your staff, I think the number one thing is be open to what they say. Even if you disagree with it, it might be way better than what you've come up with before.
Yeah, it's actually one of our strategic pillars this season in coach development team was to start with a question. And we always have to follow up with, if you know the answer, it's not a question, it's a leading statement that you're expecting. So it's almost one of those things that people think you need to have these predetermined ideas of what is right before you can actually start to be inquisitive and ask. But I love getting to that point of my coaching where it's like, I actually don't know, because I don't remember being a 10-year-old. I don't remember learning this skill for the first time. I've never played at the highest level of a particular sport. So why would I assume that I know how to do that? And I would treat, children the same as I would adults in terms of how inquisitive I am. But the questions I ask, the things I do, those elements would change. Is there any particular point, I guess, in your coaching career that you could almost sense that you'd shifted entirely? Like I've definitely got a point in time where I was like, oh, I'm looking back at the coach I was and going, who was that person?
Yeah,
have you ever had that moment?
Oh yeah, I think as I stepped into AFLW, so I had the experience with hockey, and then I stepped into AFLW. The athletes were new and different, and it was almost like they hadn't had the background and the history and the training that hockey athletes had had, or it was maybe in a different sport. So I felt like that journey initially, like particularly in the first couple of seasons, we were doing it together. I didn't know about AFW. They were quite new in their professionalism. So we were forced into like this camaraderie of like, well, let's just get it done, sharing our knowledge and doing it together. So that was definitely a turning point for me. So that's another thing. Step into a new sport.
Yeah.
You step into a new sport and coach something different and really get involved in it. I think when I went to football, I would ask some questions about why would you do that? And the answer I inevitably got was because we've always done it, or because it's what the men do. And I was like, oh, right, well, neither are a really good answer. But in the defence of AFLW, I think if I went back to hockey, I would get the same answers. And, 5-10 years ago, I might have been giving that answer as well, because it's all I knew. So, yeah, I think just explore, get out there and explore different ways of doing it.
Mm-hmm. And remember, for any of the cricket coaches and stuff on the call, you're not actually a cricket coach. You're just a coach who happens to show up to cricket training. So feel free to explore those skills in other contexts too. I mean, chances are, if you're coaching because your kid's involved in the team, your kid's also doing multiple sports, you don't have to don the whistle and the clipboard in every context. But being curious about why we do things is an underlying theme here. And I think it's a really important one to explicitly call out. It's something that I spend a lot of my life trying to be, is just openly curious where I can. And it does actually show in your coaching immediately. Thank you so much for that, Kate. That was absolutely perfect. And once again, we have not planned this for context, but that leads us on perfectly to the next section, which is like, how do we actually get to a point where our sporting systems reflect a lot of these ideas? And one of the things that we do have to overcome then is the black hole that is females in coaching. So if we start, it actually doesn't matter where we start on this slide, but I do like the cyclical nature of it, in that we have a current scarcity of female role models in coaching positions. And so this breeds a perception that coaching is male dominated. So that makes it difficult for any aspiring women coaches to find mentors and role models, and that lowers the diversification of our coaching ranks. That in turn reinforces our gender stereotyping, and we start the cycle over and over and over again. There is a reason why the statement, "you can't be what you can't see," has become this like almost call to action or cry. As much as it makes me cringe, they have a point. The visibility as an ability to then question why we've done things the way that we've always done it. And if we don't have people in those spaces who are genuinely supported to do it, it's going to make it very difficult for any of these conversations to stick. So if we start to lean into some of the content that we have at the moment, I really wanted to start with some of the positive elements. And when I was sharing this particular slide with my colleagues today, going through the presentation, a lot of them were surprised by the left-hand side. So an EY Women Athletes Business Network and ESPNW report noted that of the people that they interviewed, 94% of female execs played sport when they were younger. 74 of them actually said that a background in sport helped accelerate their career. And 75 said being competitive is actually considered an asset to their leadership style. Now, we do like to throw around and say that, sport has this ability to develop life skills. But when we put that into context, this is what we really mean. It actually has been shown in a lot of contexts that a sporting background is not just beneficial for your own movement capabilities, but your human development too. And I think hearing this in a CEO context of people who are women leaders really gives it that extra push to say that this is a space that is worth investing in. The other side of that coin, unfortunately, is that a recent research project in Victoria said that more than 90% of girls between 11 and 17 don't reach the necessary physical activity levels. And this can start really early. But when they do become physically literate, when they do have the opportunity to do so, they move twice as much as those who are not. So this is absolutely the kind of space that we can address in a sport And especially in a community grassroots sport like cricket, where there are a lot of the physical literacy skills embedded in the way that we learn to move our bodies. So, as early as 7 years old, girls are already reporting less positive attitudes and enjoyment of physical activity and sport. They feel less competent and confident in their ability to take part. And when this starts at 7, the gap between physical capabilities between girls and boys just continues to grow. But if we build a bridge between those gaps as early as possible, we find that that gap lessens over time. And a lot of our entry-level programs in cricket start as young as 5 years old. So we do actually have a chance to bridge this before it becomes a problem, because ultimately we are trying to get to a point where people feel competent and confident in the way that they move their bodies. At a fundamental level, that is the point of engaging in grassroots sport in the first place. And the fact that we learn to be competitive and strategic and, set up things along the way is a nice to have, but it is a level above, I guess, our ultimate goal. So if we look at some of the ways that we can actually generate change ourselves, increased representation and visibility are two of the biggest things that can challenge attitudes and positively influence unconscious gender bias of children associating men only in the roles of coaches. We have seen that there are previous experience, parental attitudes and satisfaction influence the perception of women coaches and officials. So early exposure, positive parental influences and support are actually needed for these people to step up into these spaces, so that we can provide opportunities ongoing that are genuinely designed for people to either become coaches for the first time or finally realize that that's what they were doing the entire time. And if we think about this in the context of the dropout rate that we have at the moment, so teenage girls are getting to the point where at 14 in particular, there is a massive cliff of participation where they choose not to engage in sport and physical activity anymore. But we know that girls have a higher satisfaction rate with female coaches. So there is a potential here to address both of these problems at the same time. If we actually have more female coaches in the adolescent teenage years for girls, will that keep them in sport for longer? And do we have the systems in place to actually allow them to become confident and competent across a lifetime? Or do we stop worrying about that after they get out of primary school? Again, more questions than answers in a lot of this space. It's not like we don't know what's happening, but the way that we approach and try to solve these problems is going to be ongoing and will develop over time. So by no means is this webinar, here are all the answers to your questions, but it is about asking better questions. And speaking of role models in this space, Mick, you are exactly the kind of role model that a lot of the research is crying out for. And I know you're going to hate me for saying that, but did that ever play into your journey through sport? And I guess, have you seen any impact along the way of being the practitioner that you are?
Yeah, I think a lot of my leadership qualities have probably been developed or realized through sport. And I guess the impact obviously goes beyond sport. But for me, like my whole journey, if I think about my leadership journey so far, a lot of those qualities have been developed through the different sports that I've been a part of. I mean, it kind of goes without saying that going through the pathway as between like kind of 12 to 18, there was absolutely no women in leadership positions / women role models, as Kate was saying before. And that's quite recent. I'm only 27 now. Probably in the last kind of 4 to 5 years, the difference that I've seen, and I guess the shift that I've seen, are these really courageous women that have stepped into leadership roles without actually having seen people in those roles previously. And I think that's a really important, part to this, is that we have these women who have stepped into these positions really with no support, and have had to take that courageous step to go, okay, I'm going to be the leader here. And unfortunately, what I've seen, again, it's probably going to continue for the next, 5-10 years until we get that support in place, but is you almost burn out, because that then becomes, you almost have an onus on yourself to be that person for everyone else below you, and for the next generation. On a positive note, I think it's been cool to transition from almost a mentee into a mentor, both from a player's perspective, and also, externally in different positions. Kate and Soph have been huge role models for me, over the last 3-4 years in different capacities, but I hadn't had that previously. So now I'm surrounded by all these incredible women in, awesome positions that are a huge part of my journey. And the skills that I learned from them will extend beyond. But I think actually coming from being a mentee to a mentor from a playing perspective is where I've seen the biggest shift, because we're at this really crazy time at the moment in women's sport, and I'm more so involved in football or soccer, where the last 2-3 years have just been insane, and we're trying to keep up with the times, but I feel like we're still kind of lagging. We still are relying on these 2-3 people at the top, for example, one of my coaches, to continue to be that person for everyone else. And that's where I think we can make the biggest impact, is actually saying, let's support these people to stay there, and we encourage people to kind of come up through the pathways and take over.
Yeah. So if there's one thing that we could do, I guess, to support that person to stay, right? Because I guarantee most clubs in any sport across the board probably has this one person that is keeping everything together, and everyone looks at that person and goes, oh, I couldn't possibly do what they do, therefore I'm going to offer no support as well. Is there one thing that you can see to think, okay, well, this is what this person needs just to make their life that little bit easier?
I mean, everyone wants to feel valued at the top. I think that, and it's not all about monetary compensation, but I think if I'm thinking specifically to, my coach at the moment, there's still a difference in the way that we value a male coach or a coach of a men's team versus a coach of a women's team. And I think that goes across the board with a lot of sports, and it's nothing new to us. But increasing the value that you put on that person is huge. And then in terms of support is actually surrounding them with other women in leadership positions, for example. So we have a huge network of women who have been courageous enough to step up into these positions, and young girls as well. We've got, even at our local club, we've got 3 or 4 new female coaches in the last year, which we didn't have previously. So being able to recognise when they have taken that courageous step, and then putting support around them, whether that's a network within your own club, a network within, for example, the wider cricket community, or even across sports, multidisciplinary. I think that's a way that we can almost rewrite the script a little bit, and be the leaders in that space in women's sport, because I know that doesn't really happen in the men's space, and probably hasn't needed to happen previously. But as we expand, I hope that we have women in leadership positions in men's sport as well, that can become kind of part of that network. That's where I see the biggest value in somewhere like WA Cricket and Western Australia.
Mm-hmm. And what inspired you to, I guess, brave this space? I know coming through it wasn't necessarily the easiest journey, and it's interesting timing as someone else who has come up through a similar system at a similar time, and has been coaching for over a decade. Was there a moment where you're like, nah, this is worth it, I'm going to stick it out here?
Probably because I'm a little bit uptight and stubborn, to be honest. I just came through the pathway, and I was like, that is, I could see there's a lot of discrepancies, and I knew that was a space that I wanted to go into and make a difference in some capacity. I feel like I'd started to realize some of my, I guess, leadership qualities, early on, but it's only really been kind of the last 3 to 5 years where I've almost made them more specific and directed towards what I'm doing. And that comes from, I feel anyway, from being surrounded by the incredible women that are on this call, and also externally, Faye Chambers is another one, who's our coach at the moment, and actually gaining advice from people who have been through what I'm going through now as in early career, even coming through as a player. So yeah, I mean, there's kind of 2 parts to it, but I think the biggest thing for me, and the biggest transformation that I found, is actually gaining that advice from people that have been there and done that. And that's, I guess, a privilege of mine, that I've actually been lucky enough to be surrounded by, these women that a lot of other people maybe haven't or won't be for a little while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I used to joke that my biggest achievement isn't how many players have gone on to play for a particular team, but one of them called me a few years ago to say that she'd started coaching, and she really liked the way that I coached her once upon a time. So is there any tips that I could give her? And I remember just crying after that phone call, being like, that is the coolest thing ever. Like, not something that you can anticipate. And I think a lot of people underestimate just being authentically in a space and just doing the best that you can have an untold impact on other people. And we really underestimate the way that that can resonate with others. So even just that sensitivity element of it, right? Of just, okay, I need to find people who understand what I'm going through so I can do the best that I can. I think is an undervalued quality in a lot of coaches. And we hear the excuse of, oh, well, I'm just a volunteer. Therefore, like I'm just doing my best. Yeah, but doing your best could probably be a little bit more sensitive to, I guess, what everyone else is experiencing too. And being able to tap into yourself and the reasons why you coach, I think is a big game changer for those people who are stepping into this role for the first time. Is there anything in particular? So recognizing your own leadership qualities can be one of those things where it's just like, even just saying that, I think can be difficult. What was the one thing that stood out to you to say, you know what, I would make a good leader. I am going to keep running with this.
Probably one of my first mentoring sessions through Gaining Ground down at the club. And I remember going down, I had done a little bit of coaching prior to that, but nothing, crazy. And I went down, it was an under 12 session, which is my favorite age group. And we were doing a bit of a warm up, running around the pitch. And one of the girls came up to me and she was like, I don't like my coach. And I was like, okay. And then some of the other girls were like pulling on her, like, don't say that, don't tell her. And so from there, we all kind of got into a circle, started stretching. The stuff that came out of their mouths was absolutely hilarious, for one, but also it was like they had just been holding in all of this information about things that they enjoyed and things that they didn't enjoy. And it was just like crazy. I'm standing there like, okay, I thought I was coming down to run a warm up and a bit of a game, but it turns out I'm actually just rewriting the whole kind of pathway at our local club. So that was, and then obviously from there, just the conversations that we had, the fact that they actually were able after that, and I've been down a couple of times since, to express what they did enjoy and what they don't enjoy. AFL is a huge one for it, like lane kicking. And it's just, especially in women's sport, and when you got female athletes, how dare you add a decision-making, game in there, or something where they actually have to be making decisions or making mistakes. And we talk about like skill acquisition, motor development. Why do those principles get thrown out the window when we're talking about female athletes? So if we've got a soccer ball on the floor, and I know this isn't applicable probably to cricket, but in some circumstances probably is, where you're just going back and forth, and we're working on technique with a 10-year-old over and over and over again for 12 to 20 minutes straight, I don't think they're going to be enjoying it, and they're probably not going to come back. So we talk about competitive nature and enjoyment. Obviously they're mutually exclusive. It's not like a continuum. You can actually enjoy being competitive and having competition. And I think that's a big point, but also actually asking your athletes what they enjoy, what parts of it they enjoy, which games that we've already played are your favorite. Like, it's just that communication and gaining information to understand, not just gaining information for the sake of gaining it.
It speaks perfectly to I think a conversation that's happening in the chat at the moment about feeling valued, right? Like, my first thought was ask them. And it kind of almost seems like a throwaway comment, but how are you supposed to know if you don't actually genuinely tap into what they would experience as value? Because for something like me, being a pat on the back after a decade of coaching, I'd be like, is that it? Like, really? Oh, I finally get recognition. Like, I never had to register as a coach, so there is no proof unless the school that I coached at tells other people that I coached. There is absolutely no proof that I've coached for over a decade. So even just that recognition element has been taken away from the fact that we don't have to really put our names down as coach. And so it can be just as easy as asking them, as much as that doesn't seem like this, complex concept that doesn't meet the criteria, I guess, of the complexity of the problem. Sometimes it can be that simple. So yeah, that's a really cool message, just to be like, look, you're not going to know the answers, so tap into theirs, and their journey is going to be different than yours, and that's kind of the point, right? Like I wouldn't want to subject people on my pathway experience, and I certainly wouldn't want the same pathway to exist, in a decade's time, when we're hopefully having slightly different conversations than this one. Slightly different, maybe not none, but maybe it evolves over time. Thank you so much for that, Mick. I really appreciate 3 generations time. That just hurts every time I read that. Thank you so much, Mick.
On Alex, on
Yeah.
that, can I just write a quote that I've got up here?
Yes, please.
Women's Sport Year of Achievement. The high achievement of Australian women's sport in the athletic and swimming events in the Empire Games earlier this year in 1950 as one of the most successful and eventful years in women's sport in Australia. Did we not have that exact word for word quote in newspapers following the Paris Olympics? So is that
the
3
most equitable
generations? So 50s to 2024. It's not quite 3 generations, but we are still doing the same things. And I think, going back to the point, we need to start asking the different questions and asking our athletes, male or female, asking people how they enjoy sport, because I think Mick made a really good point. We actually should enjoy sport, should be fun.
Yep, learning and development, competition, performance, they were never mutually exclusive to begin with. We just decided along the way that we wanted to treat them like that. Thank you so much for joining us. So we are just about to wrap up. So a really big thank you, not just to our guest speakers, but I guess to everybody who's inspired this along the way. Kate has learned a new trick on Teams and now she's using it. But of course, like the work that we're talking about, our experiences, they also speak to a deeper level to the amazing things that other people have achieved too. So I wanted to take the opportunity to thank the shoulders of the giants that we stand on in this conversation. A lot of the work that I've shared had references alongside it. So if you're curious about that work, just let me know. But we do have a gamut of people doing amazing things in this space, including a short course on supporting the female athlete, an entire research team dedicated to progressing women's sport at Victoria University and many other universities. The paper that I actually referenced all throughout this entire talk is also linked in the photo. And then, of course, other spaces that are doing some really amazing things. So all of these images are hyperlinked. Everybody who attended the session tonight will get a copy of these slides. It just lives live online. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to keep digging, to feed your curiosity as you go. I think one of the hardest parts about a forum like this is it kind of feels like once you leave the call, that's it. What else am I supposed to do? Where else am I supposed to go? So I really wanted to inspire that in the way that we interacted. And I hope that the live sort of conversations as they unfolded almost brought the human nature back into it. We're not just talking about data and research papers that live in PDFs on the internet. We are talking about these really rich experiences of our people, not just who we are, but also the people that we're interacting with. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for your interest in this space, primarily, for being here and spending your Monday night with us. Happy Women and Girls Week for cricket. And if you do have any questions or follow-ups, just let me know. I'll hang around on the call a little bit longer, but you can also flick me an email. But thank you very much for coming. And thank you again to Kate and Mikayla for being such incredible guests. Gotta go team.